You're deep beneath the Tower of London, one of the most fortified castles on Earth. You pass through a series of vaults, each sealed by a 2-ton blast-proof steel door, impervious to any force known to man. The air is cool, still, and thick with the weight of 1,000 years of English history. And then you see it. A dazzling, almost blinding light that seems to bend the very air around it. You're in the Jewel House, standing before the British Crown jewels. It's not just a collection of treasure, it's the physical embodiment of a millennium of power, conquest, and ceremony. But calling them jewels is like calling the Great Pyramid of Giza a pile of rocks, or Michelangelo's David a piece of carved marble. This is something else entirely. This is the soul of a nation, forged in gold and studded with the tears of history. Before you are 23,578 gemstones. Let that sink in for a moment. To put that in perspective, if you were to count one stone every single second without pausing for breath, it would take you over 6.5 hours just to count them all. They are set in 142 historic objects of state, from crowns and scepters to orbs, swords, and rings, each one a masterpiece of breathtaking, almost divine craftsmanship. The centerpiece of the imperial state crown, the Cullinan II diamond, weighs 317.4 carats. That's the weight of a baseball, a solid, heavy mass of compressed carbon that glitters with an internal fire. And it's considered the smaller sibling. Its big brother, the Cullinan Mang, the Great Star of Africa, is a staggering 530.2 carats. It's the largest clear-cut diamond on the planet, a teardrop of pure light that rests in the sovereign scepter. The estimated value of the entire collection? Some say $3 billion, others say $5. The truth is, they are priceless. They are literally beyond monetary value. Their political and symbolic weight is immeasurable. We see them at coronations, sparkling under the intense, unforgiving gaze of the global media spotlight. We see them as symbols of stability, of tradition, of the enduring, almost mystical majesty of the British monarchy. They are presented to us and to the world as a glorious, unbroken line of heritage, a sacred inheritance passed down through generations of divinely appointed rulers. But here's the hidden truth. What if I told you that this collection, this ultimate symbol of legitimacy, was born from an act of total destruction and chaos? That its history is not a serene progression of coronations, but a bloody, brutal saga of theft, murder, and audacious deception? That the most famous jewels in the world aren't just symbols of glory, but also of colonial plunder, systemic oppression, and deep, unsettling controversy that continues to this day? Why was a man pardoned and even rewarded with a handsome pension by the king after he was caught red-handed trying to steal the crown jewels in broad daylight? How did a priceless, blood-red gem, taken directly from the corpse of a murdered prince, become a celebrated and revered icon of British royalty? And how did the largest diamond ever discovered, a stone unearthed in a nation brutally conquered and subjugated by Britain, end up being officially classified as a gift? To answer those questions, we need to pull back the heavy velvet curtain of official history. We need to ignore the fairy tale and uncover the dark, complex, and hidden truth of the British crown jewels. Our story begins not with a king or a queen, but with a man who should have been a footnote in history. A man who, by all accounts, should have been hanged for treason multiple times over. His name was Thomas Blood, but he would go down in history as Colonel Blood. And he was perhaps the most charming, audacious, and successful rogue in the long and bloody history of England. Blood was born in County Meath, Ireland, in 1618. He wasn't a common criminal born of poverty and desperation. He came from good stock. His father was a prosperous blacksmith and landowner, and his grandfather was a respected member of Parliament who lived in a castle. He was a gentleman, educated, and by all accounts, possessed a magnetic, almost hypnotic personality. He was a man who could talk his way into and out of anything. He had the quick wit of a courtier and the hardened eyes of a soldier. When the English Civil War tore the kingdom apart in 1642, Blood, a loyal Protestant, initially came to England to fight for King Charles III. But But Thomas Blood was, above all else, a supreme pragmatist. He had a keen animal sense of which way the political wind was blowing. And as the war dragged on, it became brutally clear that Oliver Cromwell and his disciplined, fanatical parliamentarian army were going to win. So Blood didn't just surrender, he switched sides. This wasn't a quiet, shame-faced desertion. Blood joined the Roundheads and fought with such distinction and ferocity that he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. After the war, with the king beheaded and the monarchy abolished, Cromwell himself rewarded Blood for his service. He was appointed a justice of the peace and granted a large, valuable estate in Ireland. Thomas Blood had played the game and won spectacularly. He was a man of property, of status, of influence in the new Cromwellian order. But then, the great wheel of fortune turned again. In 1660, Cromwell was dead, his republic had crumbled, and Charles II, the exiled son of the King Blood, had abandoned, returned to the throne in a wave of popular euphoria. The restoration of the monarchy was a time of celebration for many, but for men like Blood, it was a catastrophe. All of Cromwell's land grants were declared void. In an instant, Blood lost his estate, his status, and his income. He was ruined, and he was furious, filled with a burning sense of injustice, while other ruined Cromwellians retired to the countryside to lick their wounds or wrote groveling letters begging for a royal pardon. Blood did something different. He declared a private war. He fled back to Ireland and joined a shadowy conspiracy of disgruntled Cromwellian soldiers. Their plan was as bold as it was treasonous: to storm Dublin Castle and kidnap the governor, the powerful Duke of Ormond, holding him hostage to force the king to restore their lands. The plot was a spectacular failure. It was discovered at the last minute, and the conspirators were scattered. Blood was identified as a ringleader, and a huge price was put on his head. He was now one of the most wanted men in the kingdom. He fled to Holland, living among other political exiles, a man without a country or a cause. But Thomas Blood was not most men. For him, being a fugitive was not an end, but an opportunity. In 1670, in an act of almost unbelievable audacity, he returned to England. While wanted posters bearing his description were nailed to tavern doors across the country, Blood set himself up in Romford, a bustling town just outside London, under the alias Dr. Iloff. He began practicing as a doctor, and with his natural charm and confidence, he became quite popular. But the quiet life of a country doctor wasn't for him. The fire of rebellion still burned in his belly, and as it happened, the Duke of Ormond, the man he had tried to kidnap years earlier, was also in London. Blood held a grudge. In December 1670, he put his medical practice on hold and decided to finish the job. The plan was to ambush the Duke's coach in the middle of St. James's Street, one of London's busiest thoroughfares, drag him to Tyburn, the infamous site of public executions, and hang him like a common criminal. The attempt was another botched, almost comical disaster. The Duke, an old but tough nobleman, fought back fiercely. His servants were alerted, and Blood was forced to flee, narrowly escaping capture after a chaotic chase through the muddy London streets. He had now attempted to kidnap one of the most powerful men in the country, twice, and failed. He was a laughingstock in the underworld, a failed rebel, a wanted man living under a false name. He needed money. He needed to restore his tattered reputation. He needed a plan so bold, so insane, that it would either see him hanged, drawn, and quartered, or make him a legend for all time. And as he skulked in the shadows of London, a new, magnificent idea began to form. An idea that would target the ultimate symbol of the very monarchy he despised. He wasn't going to kidnap a duke. He was going to steal the crown jewels. Now, you have to understand what this meant in 1671. The crown jewels weren't just expensive. They were the physical manifestation of the divine right of kings. They had been remade just a decade earlier, after the originals were famously melted down and sold off by Cromwell's Republic, a symbolic act of destroying the monarchy itself. The new set, made for Charles II's coronation, was a powerful statement that the monarchy was back, more glorious than ever. To steal them wasn't just theft. It was a profound act of political defiance. It was, in essence, stealing the soul of the nation. And they were kept in the Tower of London, a fortress that had stood for 600 years, a place of dread and power. They were housed in a basement chamber in the Martin Tower, secured behind a heavy iron grill, and they were guarded by a man named Talbot Edwards, the keeper of the jewels. Edwards wasn't just a guard, he was a 77-year-old war veteran, a man who had lived through the trauma of the Civil War and had dedicated his life to the service of the restored monarchy. He was trusted, fiercely loyal, and he lived in a modest apartment directly above the jewel chamber with his wife and family. He was the living embodiment of the old, loyal England that Blood despised. To get to the jewels, you had to get through him. And to get to him, you needed a plan of almost diabolical cunning. This is where Colonel Blood's genius for deception truly shines. He didn't plan a frontal assault with swords and pistols. He planned a social infiltration, a long con. One day in 1671, a jovial country parson with a long black cloak and a friendly, pious demeanor arrived at the tower. He told Talbot Edwards he was visiting London and simply had to see the famous jewels he had heard so much about. This, of course, was Colonel Blood in disguise. Blood laid on the charm. He praised the dazzling beauty of the jewels. He praised Edward's unwavering loyalty. He praised the wisdom and glory of the king. He was so friendly, so engaging, that the elderly keeper was completely taken in. A few days later, Parson Blood returned, this time with a woman he introduced as his wife. As they were leaving, Mrs. Blood was suddenly seized by a violent, writhing stomachache. It was a brilliant, calculated piece of theater. The kindly Mrs. Edwards, the keeper's wife, immediately took the distressed woman upstairs to their private apartment to rest and recover. This was the crucial step. Blood had breached the first line of defense. He was now inside the keeper's home, a trusted guest. The grateful parson returned a few days later with a gift from Mrs. Edwards, 4 pairs of fine white gloves, to thank her for her Christian kindness. The trap was being meticulously set. Over the next few weeks, Parson Blood became a close family friend. He would visit often, sharing stories and a bottle of wine with the Edwards family. They came to love this charming, pious man from the country. So when he eventually made a proposal, it seemed like a dream come true. The parson mentioned he had a wealthy, unmarried nephew who was looking for a good, respectable wife. Old Talbot Edwards had a pretty unmarried daughter. A match was proposed. A meeting was arranged to finalize the betrothal. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. Blood's plan was a masterpiece of social engineering, but it required accomplices, men he could trust with his life. He recruited his son, Thomas Jr., a young man in his early 20s, eager to prove himself and fiercely loyal to his father's rebellious cause. He also brought in a man named Robert Perrot, another former Cromwellian soldier, a man with a shared sense of grievance against the restored monarchy. And finally, there was his brother-in-law, James Hunt, a man tasked with a very specific and very difficult job that would require brute force and a steady nerve. The morning of May 9th, 671. At 7 a.m. sharp, a time chosen for its quietness before the tower bustled with activity, Parson Blood arrived at the Martin Tower. He was with his supposed nephew, his own son Thomas, dressed for the part of a wealthy suitor, and his 2 other men. They were all armed with short swords and pistols, loaded with ball and powder, hidden beneath their respectable-looking cloaks. They carried a bag filled with tools, including a heavy wooden mallet, a file, and restraints. Talbot Edwards, the old keeper, delighted at the prospect of securing a wealthy and respectable husband for his daughter, welcomed them warmly. The nephew was introduced to Edward's daughter, and the 2 were left to get acquainted in the family's living quarters. To pass the time while the young couple chatted, Blood and his other 2 men expressed a desire to see the famous crown jewels one more time as a treat before the wedding negotiations began in earnest. The old keeper, his mind on his daughter's happy future, suspected nothing. He was happy to oblige his new friend, the parson. He led them down the narrow, winding stone steps into the basement chamber. The air grew cold and damp. Edwards produced a large, ornate key and unlocked the heavy oak door to the jewel house. The men stepped inside. Before them, glittering in the dim lamplight, lay the sacred symbols of the English monarchy. As the old keeper turned to lock the door behind them, a standard security procedure, the friendly demeanor of Parson Blood vanished. In his place stood Colonel Blood, the hardened rebel. He threw a heavy cloak over Edwards's head to muffle his cries, and in the same swift, brutal motion, struck him on the head with the wooden mallet. The 77-year-old keeper crumpled to the stone floor, unconscious. But Edwards was a veteran of the Civil War, tougher than he looked. As Blood and his men struggled to remove the heavy iron grill from the front of the display, the old man began to stir. So Blood did something truly ruthless. He drew a dagger and stabbed him in the belly, a vicious, silencing blow. "We'll have to kill him," one of the accomplices whispered in panic. But Blood, ever the pragmatist, refused. "We are here for the jewels, not the man's blood." A strange sentiment from a man whose name was Blood. They believed Edwards was dying, so they turned their attention back to the prize. The grill was wrenched aside with a groan of tortured metal. They were in. Perrault grabbed the solid gold orb of state and, finding it too large to hide, simply stuffed it down the front of his breeches. Blood took the magnificent St. Edward's crown, the sacred coronation crown itself. But it was far too large to conceal, so he took the mallet and with a series of sickening thuds began to hammer it flat, stuffing the bent, desecrated, priceless artifact into a large bag. Then came the biggest challenge. The scepter with the cross, a solid gold rod nearly 5 feet long. It was far too long to hide in a bag or under a cloak. This was James Hunt's job. He pulled out a heavy metal file and began frantically trying to saw the golden rod in half. Imagine the sound. The high-pitched screech of metal on metal, a sound of pure desecration echoing in the stone vault as they brutalized this sacred object. It was at this exact moment that fate, or perhaps just sheer bad luck, intervened. In a twist worthy of a Hollywood movie, Talbot Edwards' son, who had been serving in the army in Flanders, had unexpectedly returned home that very morning. He had arrived at the tower to surprise his family. Hearing the strange noises in the basement, he called down the stairs to his father. Silence. The son, alarmed, started down the stairs. Inside the vault, the thieves panicked, but the old keeper, miraculously, was not dead. He had been feigning death, waiting for his moment. As he heard his son's voice, he summoned his last ounce of strength and began to shout with all his might, "Treason! Murder! The crown is stolen!" All hell broke loose. Blood and his men dropped the half-sawn scepter. They grabbed the flattened crown and the orb and bolted for the exit. They scrambled up the stairs, past the shocked son, and out of the Martin Tower. They ran for the Iron Gate, the main exit of the Tower of London, hoping to get across the drawbridge and blend in with the morning crowds on Tower Hill. But the alarm was spreading like wildfire. The cry of "treason" echoed across the courtyards. The tower guards, the famous yeoman warders in their distinctive red uniforms, were alerted. One of the guards, a man named Captain Beckman, whose own son had been with young Edwards, confronted Blood as he tried to pass the gate. Blood didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and fired point blank. The gun misfired. Blood was tackled to the ground, still clutching the bag containing the flattened crown. He fought like a cornered animal, biting and kicking. "It is a worthy attempt, though it has failed," he roared. Perrault was captured nearby, the orb of state ignominiously rolling from his breeches as he fell. The other accomplices were rounded up shortly after. The most audacious heist in English history was over. Colonel Blood was taken into custody and thrown into the tower's darkest dungeon. He was a known traitor, a failed kidnapper, and now a jewel thief who had assaulted a 77-year-old man in the king's own fortress. His execution was a foregone conclusion. The only question was how gruesome it would be. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was the standard horrific punishment for treason. But then, Blood played his final, most brilliant card. He refused to speak. He sat in his cell in chains, defiant and silent. He would answer to no one, he declared, but the king himself. It was an incredibly bold, almost insane gamble. He was counting on the unique personality of the king, Charles II. Charles was known as the Merry Monarch. He was cynical, witty, and deeply appreciative of audacity and men who lived by their own rules. He was intrigued. Why would a man attempt something so impossible? What kind of man was this? The king agreed to a meeting. Colonel Thomas Blood, the failed rebel and captured thief, was brought to the palace. He stood before King Charles, Prince Rupert, the Duke of York, and the other great lords of the court. This was his one and only chance, and he seized it with both hands. He wasn't repentant, he was magnificent. He confessed to everything, not just the jewel theft, but the plot to kidnap the Duke of Ormond. He told the king he had once hidden amongst the reeds by the riverbank, intending to shoot him while he was swimming, but had been so overcome by the king's awe and majesty that he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. It was pure, unadulterated flattery, delivered with the confidence of a master showman. Then, he delivered his masterstroke. He warned the king that he was part of a vast secret network of hundreds of disgruntled Cromwellian soldiers, all sworn to a blood oath. If he were to be executed, his followers would surely avenge his death, and the king's own life would be in constant peril. It was a thinly veiled threat, wrapped in a performance of grudging loyalty. And the king was utterly captivated. He was amused by Blood's sheer, unmitigated nerve. When Blood told him that he had valued the crown jewels at only $6,000, a fraction of their official worth, the king burst out laughing. Finally, Charles asked him the question that must have been on everyone's mind. "What if I should give you your life?" Blood, with a humble bow, replied, "I would endeavor to deserve it, sire." What happened next shocked the entire kingdom to its core. King Charles II not only pardoned Colonel Blood, he granted him a full royal pension. He was given back his confiscated Irish lands worth $500 a year, a fortune at the time. The man who stole the crown jewels was not only a free man, he was a rich one. He became a familiar and feared figure at court, often seen in the king's presence. And what of Talbot Edwards, the loyal old keeper who had nearly been killed defending the jewels? He recovered from his wounds, but the king's reward was meager. He was granted a small pension, which was often paid late, if at all. He lived out his days recounting the story to visitors, a living exhibit of the day the crown jewels were almost lost. He died a few years later, a poor and largely forgotten man. The injustice was staggering, and the public was bewildered. The message was clear. In the cynical court of the merry monarch, audacity was rewarded more than loyalty. Crime, if committed with enough style and panache, did pay. The crown jewels were safe, but the monarchy's reputation was tarnished by this bizarre and inexplicable act of royal clemency. Colonel Blood's story is a tale of theatrical audacity, a bizarre caper that ended not with a hanging, but with a royal pension. It's a story the monarchy can almost laugh about now, a historical curiosity. But the hidden truth of the crown jewels contains another far darker story of theft. A story that isn't about a charming rogue, but about the brutal, inexorable mechanics of empire. And it centers on a single legendary stone, the Koh-i-Noor, the Mountain of Light. This is a diamond that has been the subject of myth, legend, and bloodshed for centuries. It is said to be cursed, bringing bad luck and a violent end to any man who dares to own or wear it. Its origins are lost to the mists of time, but it is believed to have been discovered in the fabled Kolar mine in India hundreds, perhaps thousands of years ago. Hindu texts from the 14th century may refer to it, describing a massive diamond of unparalleled beauty and value, a gift from the gods. It was never just a stone, it was a talisman of sovereignty. The ruler who held the Koh-i-Noor held the destiny of India in his hands. Unlike Colonel Blood's crude mallet, the forces that brought the Koh-i-Noor to Britain were far more powerful and far more insidious. The story begins not with a heist, but with a conquest. For centuries, the diamond passed through the hands of warring empires like a deadly, glittering prize. It was a spoil of war, a symbol of ultimate power. It was held by the Kakatiya dynasty until the early 14th century, when the armies of the Delhi Sultanate swept down from the north, looting it from a Hindu temple. It passed to the Mughal emperors, the richest and most powerful dynasty on earth. It was set by the great emperor Shah Jahan into his magnificent jewel-encrusted peacock throne, a throne so opulent it was said to have cost twice as much as the Taj Mahal. Imagine the Mughal court in Delhi, a world of unimaginable wealth and splendor, and at its heart, the peacock throne, with the Koh-i-Noor glittering at the head of a peacock, its internal fire reflecting the power of the emperor. But that very splendor made it a target. In 1739, the Persian warlord Nader Shah, a brutal and ambitious conqueror, swept into India and sacked Delhi. His army massacred the city's inhabitants and systematically looted the Mughal treasury. It is said that when he first saw the great diamond on the throne, he was the one who exclaimed, "Koh-i-Noor, Mountain of Light." After Nader Shah's assassination, the diamond fell into the hands of his Afghan successors, and for decades it was the bloody prize of the Durrani Empire. By the early 19th century, it had made its way back to India, into the treasury of the powerful Sikh Empire in the Punjab, ruled by the formidable Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Ranjit Singh, the Lion of the Punjab, was a brilliant military and political strategist who carved out a vast and powerful empire. He understood the diamond's symbolic power. He had obtained it himself by forcing it from a fleeing Afghan ruler in exchange for sanctuary. He wore it on his arm, a glittering symbol of his sovereignty. But he also knew that the British, who controlled much of the rest of India through the rapacious East India Company, coveted it. On his deathbed in 1839, he allegedly willed the diamond not to his sons, but to a Hindu temple, in a last desperate attempt to keep it within India and out of British hands. His wish was ignored. After his death, the Sikh Empire was plunged into a decade of instability, assassinations, and internal conflict. The British, ever opportunistic, saw their chance. They provoked a series of wars, the Anglo-Sikh Wars, which were brutal, bloody affairs. The Sikh armies fought with incredible bravery, but they were ultimately no match for the disciplined, technologically superior forces of the East India Company. In 1849, the British were victorious. The Sikh Empire was broken, and its new Maharaja was a boy named Duleep Singh. He was just 10 years old. This is where the official story, the one you'll hear at the Tower of London, begins, and it is a masterpiece of imperial deception. The document that ended the war was the last Treaty of Lahore, and buried in its articles was a clause that dealt with the Koh-i-Noor. The treaty stipulated that the young Maharaja, Duleep Singh, would resign from his sovereignty, and that the gem called the Koh-i-Noor shall be surrendered by the Maharaja of Lahore to the Queen of England. Surrendered. Let that word sink in. This was not a negotiation between equals. This was a treaty dictated by a conquering power to a defeated nation. It was signed by a 10-year-old boy who had just seen his kingdom destroyed, his army slaughtered, and his mother, the formidable Rani Jindan, dragged into exile. He was a child, a puppet king, surrounded by his British guardians who controlled his every move. Lord Dalhousie, the Governor-General of India and the architect of the annexation, was explicit. He saw the Koh-i-Noor not as a spoil of war, but as a symbol of conquest. He wrote that its acquisition was a just and necessary act to demonstrate the transfer of power from the Sikh Empire to the British Empire. He arranged a formal ceremony in the Great Hall of the Lahore Fort, where the 10-year-old Duleep Singh was made to personally hand over the diamond to the British representatives. Imagine you're that boy. You're 10 years old. You are the last king of a proud and mighty empire, and you are forced in a humiliating public ceremony to give away the most potent symbol of your people's sovereignty to the foreign men who have just conquered your homeland. To call this a surrender is a fiction. It was a confiscation. It was plunder, sanitized by the language of a legal treaty. The diamond was shipped to England, but its journey was fraught with peril. The ship it was on was ravaged by cholera. Then it was battered by a typhoon for 12 hours. The curse of the Koh-i-Noor, it seemed, was already at work, but it finally arrived in 1850 and was presented to Queen Victoria. A year later, it was the star attraction at the Great Exhibition in London, a grand festival of British industry and imperial might, housed in the magnificent Crystal Palace. But the public was underwhelmed. The Indian cut of the diamond, which prioritized its size and was designed to be viewed in candlelight, didn't sparkle enough for European tastes. It looked, to many, like a dull lump of glass. So Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, a man obsessed with modernity and progress, decided it needed an upgrade. He ordered the diamond to be recut. This was a hugely controversial decision. The recutting would reduce the diamond's size significantly, destroying its historical form. It took 38 agonizing days using a steam-powered engine. The 186-carat stone was reduced to the 105.6-carat diamond we see today. Its history was literally carved away to make it more aesthetically pleasing to the British eye. From then on, adhering to the legend of the curse, it was only ever worn by female members of the royal family. It was set in a brooch for Queen Victoria, then in the crown of Queen Alexandra, then Queen Mary, and finally, in 1937, it was placed in the crown made for Queen Elizabeth, the wife of King George VI, where it remains to this day. But here's the hidden truth that lies behind the sparkle. The British government has always maintained that the Koh-i-Noor was obtained legally, a gift under the terms of the Treaty of Lahore. In 2018, in a move that caused widespread outrage, the Indian government's own archaeological survey told its Supreme Court that the diamond was surrendered and was neither stolen nor forcibly taken away. But this is a legalistic fantasy. It ignores the fundamental reality of power. Can a child, under military occupation, truly consent to giving away the most valuable possession of his nation? The governments of India, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan have all at various times demanded the diamond's return. They see it not as a legally acquired gem, but as a stolen artifact, a painful, glittering symbol of their colonial past. The story of the Koh-i-Noor is the story of empire. It's a story of how power can be laundered through treaties, how theft can be disguised as a gift, and how the history of the conquered can be rewritten by the conquerors. It is a far cry from the comical tale of Colonel Blood. There is no charming rogue here, only the cold, hard reality of a boy king and the empire that took his kingdom and his diamond. The story of the Koh-i-Noor exposes the dark heart of Britain's imperial past, but it is not a solitary stain on the glittering collection. In fact, the very crown that holds the Koh-i-Noor's smaller, recut cousin, the imperial state crown, also holds another, even larger diamond, a stone whose story is a carbon copy of colonial domination wrapped in the comforting fiction of a generous gift. This is the story of the Cullinan diamond, the great star of Africa. Picture this. It's January 26, 1905. The Premier Mine near Pretoria, South Africa. A mine superintendent named Frederick Wells is doing a routine inspection 18 feet below the sun-baked surface when he sees a glint of light from the rock wall above him. It's not the usual sparkle of a small embedded stone. This is a brilliant flash, reflecting the sun with an almost supernatural intensity. Thinking it's just a large piece of worthless crystal deliberately planted by miners as a practical joke, he pries it out with his pocket knife. It's a rock so large it fits awkwardly in the palm of his hand. It weighs over a pound. It wasn't worthless crystal, it was the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever discovered, 306 carats. Let that sink in. The Koh-i-Noor, in its original form, was a mere 186 carats. This was more than 16 times larger. It was the size of a human heart. It was, and remains, a geological freak of nature, a stone of unimaginable scale and purity, formed deep within the Earth's mantle over 1 billion years ago. The official story of how this incredible stone came to be in the British Crown Jewels is simple and heartwarming. It was a gift, a token of friendship and loyalty from the people of the Transvaal, a region in modern-day South Africa, to King Edward VII for his 66th birthday in 1907. It's a lovely story. A colony grateful for the benefits of British rule, presenting the monarch with the most magnificent jewel the world has ever seen. It's a story of peace, loyalty, and affection. But it is a lie, a carefully constructed deception that hides a history of war, conquest, and racial subjugation. To understand the real story, you have to understand what the Transvaal was in 1905. Just 3 years earlier, it had been an independent republic founded by Dutch settlers known as Boers. But the discovery of diamonds in the 1860s and then vast quantities of gold in the 1880s had sealed its fate. The British Empire, the most powerful and rapacious entity on the planet, wanted that wealth. What followed were the Anglo-Boer Wars, two exceptionally brutal conflicts. The British, facing fierce guerrilla resistance, responded with a scorched earth policy. They burned Boer farms, destroyed crops, and pioneered the use of concentration camps, where tens of thousands of Boer women and children died from disease and starvation. Black Africans were also interned in separate, even more squalid camps, where at least 14,000 are known to have perished. It was a war of total domination, a war to break the will of a people and seize control of their land and its resources. By 1902, the Boers were defeated. Their independent republic was gone, absorbed into the British Empire. The Transvaal was now a British colony, ruled by a British government, and its people were the newly conquered, traumatized subjects of the very king who would receive their gift. So who exactly decided to give this diamond away? It wasn't the Boer people who had been defeated. It certainly wasn't the Black African population who had been dispossessed of their lands and were treated as second-class citizens, their labor exploited in the very mines where the diamond was found. No. The decision was made by the new British colonial government of the Transvaal, a government led by men like Louis Botha, a former Boer general who had fought the British but was now the prime minister of the colony, collaborating with his former enemies to secure a place for himself in the new order. The colonial government purchased the diamond from the mine's owner, Thomas Cullinan, for $150,000, a massive sum equivalent to over $22 million today. Then, in an act of supreme political theater, they held a vote in the colonial parliament to present it to King Edward VII as a gift from the people of the Transvaal to show their supposed loyalty and heal the wounds of the recent war. Let's be clear about what this was. The British conquered a nation. A British-run colonial government, led by a collaborating former enemy, then used that nation's money to buy a diamond found on that nation's land. And then they gave it to the British king. It was a transaction that took place entirely within the closed loop of the British Empire, funded by the resources of a conquered territory, yet presented to the world as a gesture of friendship from a grateful people. It was imperial money laundering on a grand scale. The deception didn't stop there. The colonial government was terrified the diamond would be stolen on its journey to England, so they arranged another piece of theater. A fake diamond was ceremoniously placed aboard a steamship in Cape Town, surrounded by detectives and locked in the captain's safe for its journey to London. It was a deliberate diversion. The real Cullinan diamond, all 3,106 carats of it, was put in a plain cardboard box and sent to London by registered post. Once in London, the diamond was taken to Amsterdam to be cut by the legendary Joseph Asher. The pressure was immense. The stone was so large and so valuable that a single mistake, a single miscalculation, could shatter it into worthless fragments. Asher reportedly studied the diamond for weeks, planning his first cut. The story goes that when he finally struck the cleaving blade, he fainted from the stress. But the cut was perfect. Over the next 8 months, the great rough stone was transformed into 9 major diamonds, named Cullinan the Varn through Nye, and 96 smaller brilliants. The 2 largest pieces, the Cullinan Ma and Cullinan II, became the new stars of the crown jewels. The Cullinan Y, the great star of Africa, at 530 carats, was placed at the head of the sovereign's scepter. The Cullinan II, a mere 317 carats, was set in the front of the imperial state crown, right below another stone with a bloody history, the Black Prince's ruby. They are bookends of brutal acquisition, one taken from a murdered prince in the 14th century, the other from a conquered nation in the 20th. Today, as with the Koh-i-Noor, there are growing calls for the Cullinan diamonds to be returned to South Africa. Activists have filed lawsuits, petitions have gathered thousands of signatures. They argue that a stolen object cannot be legitimately gifted and that the diamond is a symbol of a brutal colonial history that Britain has never fully acknowledged. As one South African academic, Evaristo Benyeira, put it, receiving a stolen diamond does not exonerate the receiver. The British government, of course, rejects this. They hold to the official story. It was a gift, legally and freely given by a democratically elected government, a government that at the time denied the vote to the vast majority of the population it claimed to represent. This is the crisis at the heart of the crown jewels. The stories of the Koh-i-Noor and the Cullinan diamond are not anomalies. They are the system. They reveal a pattern of acquisition where the line between prize of war, plunder, and legal possession becomes impossibly blurred. The jewels are not just beautiful objects, they are evidence. They are silent witnesses to the uncomfortable, often brutal reality of how the British Empire was built. And they aren't the only ones. Take the stone at the very center of the imperial state crown, the one that looks like a huge blood-red ruby. It's called the Black Prince's Ruby. But it's not a ruby at all. It's a spinel. And its history is a lurid tale of medieval murder and betrayal, a gem taken from the corpse of a Spanish prince by an English one as payment for a war. Every major stone tells a similar story, a story of power taking what it wants and then writing a history to justify the theft. The crown jewels are not a static collection, they are a living crime scene. So we return to the questions we asked at the beginning. Why was a man rewarded for stealing the crown jewels? How did the treasures of conquered nations become celebrated symbols of British heritage? And how has this collection, with its dark and bloody history, survived as a legitimate symbol of power in the modern world? The answer to all three questions is the same: storytelling. The true, enduring power of the monarchy and the ultimate secret to the survival of its jewels lies in its unparalleled ability to control the narrative, to launder history, to transform theft into triumph and plunder into prestige. Think about the two great thefts we've examined. Colonel Blood's was a direct physical assault on the system. It was audacious, violent, and a complete failure, and yet he was rewarded. Why? Because his story could be controlled and reshaped. King Charles II, the cynical merry monarch, transformed Blood from a dangerous traitor into a charming rogue, a court jester whose antics were more amusing than threatening. The story became a funny anecdote, a testament to the king's own magnanimity and unflappable sense of humor. By pardoning Blood, Charles defanged the threat, turning a serious act of treason into a piece of entertaining theater. The system wasn't weakened, it was made to look more confident, more unshakable, more magnanimous. But the acquisitions of the Koh-i-Noor and the Cullinan diamond were different. This wasn't an attack on the system. This was the system in operation. This was the machinery of empire, grinding forward, consuming lands, peoples, and their treasures with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. This kind of theft couldn't be laughed off. It was too brutal, too systemic, too recent, so it had to be disguised. And so, a different kind of story was written, a story of legality and legitimacy, written in the ink of treaties and parliamentary votes. A 10-year-old boy king, under the watchful eye of a conquering army, doesn't have his kingdom's greatest treasure confiscated. He surrenders it under the terms of a treaty. A nation, freshly subjugated by a brutal war and the horror of concentration camps, doesn't have its mineral wealth extracted. Its colonial government gifts it as a token of loyalty. This is the hidden genius of the crown jewels. They are not just a collection of gems, they are a collection of stories. Each stone has been polished twice, once by the lapidary to make it sparkle, and a second time by the monarchy's historians to cleanse it of its bloody origins. The Black Prince's ruby isn't a spoil of murder. It's a battle-worn relic of a heroic English king. The Koh-i-Noor isn't a symbol of colonial subjugation. It's a dazzling centerpiece of imperial majesty. The Cullinan isn't the fruit of conquest. It's a symbol of reconciliation. And this tradition of theft and narrative laundering is older than the monarchy itself. Let's go back further. Long before Colonel Blood, before the Empire, before even the Tudors, the year is 1303. King Edward I is away at war in Scotland, and the royal treasury is housed in a supposedly impregnable crypt beneath Westminster Abbey. A man named Richard Pudlicott, a disgruntled merchant who had been imprisoned for the king's debts, sees an opportunity for revenge. Over a period of months, he patiently works at night using chisels and small iron tools to break through the stone walls of the treasury. He gets in, and over several nights he hauls away a vast fortune in gold, silver, and jewels, the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars today. The theft is so vast that he has to bury some of it under bushes to retrieve later. When the loot starts showing up in London's brothels and pawn shops, Pudlicott is arrested, he confesses, and is hanged. But here's the key part of the story. Suspicion immediately fell on the monks of Westminster Abbey. It was clearly an inside job, but Pudlicott's confession conveniently exonerated them, taking the full blame. An example was made, the system was seen to work, and the uncomfortable truth of corruption within the church was swept under the rug. The story was controlled. It's the same pattern, repeated over and over for 700 years. For centuries, this narrative control was absolute. The stories told by the empire were the only stories that mattered, but the world has changed. The empire is gone, and the descendants of the conquered are now demanding the right to tell their own stories, armed with the tools of a global, interconnected world. Today, the crown jewels are facing a crisis of narrative. The calls for repatriation from India, South Africa, Pakistan, and Afghanistan are not just about the return of valuable objects. They are about the reclamation of history. They are a demand that Britain acknowledge the truth behind the fairy tales, that it acknowledges that the foundations of its national spectacle are, in many cases, the stolen heritage of other nations. The monarchy, for its part, remains silent, trapped in a gilded cage of its own making. To admit the truth would be to unravel the entire story they have so carefully constructed for centuries. It would be to admit that the symbol of their legitimacy is, in fact, a symbol of profound injustice, and so the jewels remain in the tower, under armed guard, prisoners of their own dark history. So the next time you see the crown jewels, glittering under the lights of a coronation or a state opening of Parliament, look closer. Look past the dazzling fire of the diamonds. Look into the heart of the stones. In the great star of Africa, see the shadow of the Boer War concentration camps. In the deep deceptive red of the Black Prince's ruby, see the ghost of a murdered prince, and in the mesmerizing, endlessly deep facets of the Koh-i-Noor, see the sad, lonely eyes of a 10-year-old boy forced to hand over the soul of his kingdom. The hidden truth of the British crown jewels is not that they were stolen. It's that we have been convinced for centuries to forget the thefts. We have been told a story of glory, of tradition, of divine right, but the stones themselves tell a different story. A story of blood and of iron and of the enduring power of a good story to hide a multitude of sins.